In this video, we're going to go behind the scenes on the visual effects breakdown for Zack Snyder's The Army of the Dead. This is part 1 in the 5-part series. We're exploring Army of the Dead's opening sequence and all the major visual effects shots. Throughout this video, we're going to go deep into deconstructing the visual effects process of the film from the unique perspective of a visual effects supervisor. We'll discuss the work involved, the techniques, the technology, the process, all the key sequences of the film, and how all of them were created. I'm Allan McKay, I'm a visual effects supervisor in Hollywood. I've been working in the industry for over 25 years for studios like Industrial Light and Magic and dozens of other leading visual effects studios. On projects like Game of Thrones, Transformers, Star Trek, Superman Returns, Avengers Endgame, and many others. My goal is to teach artists and creators the skills and the knowledge to build a successful career in the creative industry, as well as the business side of being an artist. This is a 5-part video series. Each day this week, I'll be reviewing a new sequence of the film, as well as a compilation of all the visual effects at the end of the week. The goal is simply to break down and explain the shots and the challenges for each of these sequences, and share my thoughts as a visual effects supervisor on how I would approach a lot of these shots. Typically, we're handed a script. We've got to break down exactly what we need to do and allocate the right studios and the right people to each of these sequences. So this is an opportunity to be able to break down my thoughts on how I would approach a lot of these sequences, and also discuss a lot of what's involved in that creative process. By the way, if you're enjoying the series, all the content that I have on this channel I make for free. All I ask in return is if you could please subscribe to this channel and like this video. It won't mean much to you, but it'll mean the world to me. And you won't miss out on any of the upcoming material that I'll be putting out daily. Finally, if there's a particular movie that you want to see covered in the upcoming visual effects breakdowns, let me know, leave a comment below, as well as any questions that you might have about anything that wasn't covered or discussed here. I'm happy to answer all of that as well. So, let's get started. Okay, so I'm going to dive right into this. I'm super excited to go through these sequences. We're going to talk about the nuclear bomb going off in Vegas. We're going to talk about Valentine, the zombie tiger. We talk about a lot of the random effects. There's a lot of stuff that we'll get into throughout all this, you know, whether it's digital explosions or 100 other things. After going through the Iron Man visual effects breakdown, I realized that it's very easy for me just to assume everyone knows everything and get really granular about some very subtle things and not talk about the whole process. So I realized there were a lot of people that, while I was talking about it all, stuff that I take for granted, others are able to benefit a lot from me going in depth on. So bear with me this time around. I'm going to just really over-explain a lot of stuff. I think it's still going to be beneficial for a lot of us. Sometimes a few of you might say like, duh, I know that already, but I figure like, why not? Like, let's just go really in depth about like how you would pull these shots off, and we can go from there. And give me your feedback. If I'm going too basic, let me know, and I'm happy to go way more technical, okay? But at the same time, the opening sequence is a lot of random shots. There's going to be a lot of stuff we're going to get into, and, you know, I think it'll just be a fun free-for-all to kind of discuss some of this stuff. And I'm also going to get into some of the other stuff a little bit further into this that I figured I'd kind of pocket in here too as well. So that being said, I'm going to talk initially about the start here. There's a lot of jump cuts. It's kind of interesting seeing the opening sequence where a majority of it's all slow motion, and I love the crooner music in the background because I was actually having dinner with one of the VFX soups for Warner Brothers just a few weeks ago, and I was telling him about who Richard Cheese is. And if you're curious to know who did the song Viva Las Vegas, the cover for it in here, it's actually Richard Cheese, which I just thought was hilarious that they got him to do that. Because he does a lot of covers in that style, but typically for like Rage Against the Machine or just random stuff that Britney Spears, the stuff you wouldn't expect. So the opening sequence is primarily all slow motion. I think it's probably like 120 FPS, it feels like. But then it's got jump cuts throughout it, which I thought was kind of interesting, kind of having that approach where it's slow motion but jump cuts all the way through. So you get stuff like that happening where you can see it jump, jump, jump to each of the impacts it's cut to. With this stuff, like typically you would use squibs, and I'm sure they probably had some stuff in there, but these are all, I believe, I mean, not I believe, they're definitely digital sims of Liquid. So this sort of thing, you'll get a lot of type of work like this when you're working in effects, where whenever someone's getting stabbed or cut or shot, what will usually happen is you're going to go in, you'll have like a rough match move of the talent, and then you'll attach, if this was the back of the dude's head, you basically take like a section of that and use that and attach an emitter to it to spurt out blood. And the whole idea is partially to have this as a collision object, but also as an occlusion object, so that way it's all falling behind too. And yeah, to have all the liquid kind of spurting out everywhere from that point. And that sort of stuff, like whether it's something like this or whether it's like sword fights and cutting and slashing, it's just a lot easier to do all that stuff, and it means you can do retakes very easily, because otherwise what ends up happening is every single take you've got to go and do multiple wardrobe changes just for that. Or you just do it digital and you just, you know, move your head back, and then it might cost like 4 or 5 grand per shot when you're bidding it out as multiple shots that are all very similar. So something like that, do it all digital. It's a bit of camera tracking, a bit of match moving, and you can see it all kind of splats on the ground there. And I'd say you also got your digital muzzle flash here as well. So those are the visual effects for the shot. But then you got all the stuff in the background. So the way that all this has been shot is that I believe they had a couple of sound stages and just some backlots set up in New Mexico, that like in Albuquerque, that they did a majority of the Vegas shooting at. And there's a few location shoots in Atlanta just for specific shots. I think like the Old Boy diner at the beginning, and that's just about it. And then the rest of it was actually just yeah, soundstage, but then like the digital Vegas to do a lot of this. So the way that you would have this is pretty much going to be like the foreground here, going back to about here, is going to be all shot in camera, and then all this is more than likely green screen. I usually just assume green screen for everything, but for any like nighttime lit shots like this, you almost would really benefit from having some kind of rear projection set up. So who knows, I need to look into it more, but that's pretty much it. It's just like most of the exterior shots of Vegas, because obviously Vegas during COVID, especially, they're all being shot in New Mexico. So I'm just gonna jump ahead a little bit here. So this is all actually part of the same shot, and then you got this happening, and then you have the alpha zombie walking through the explosion. And again, from a story perspective, I think it's kind of interesting just because it kind of points out that, like, you know, no one's really paying attention to this massive explosions going on. They're all too busy being attacked. But on top of that, like, this dude's just so fearless. He's just walking through it all. So, I mean, there's a few kind of subtle narrative things happening with it. But just to kind of talk a bit about this for a second, I'm always hesitant to break down people's work just because I don't want to pick on anyone. But there's a couple things I'll bring up really quick. So a couple things I'll quickly mention. Typically, you've got these shooters coming out. These are the kind of streaks coming out here. That sort of stuff is a really good element to have as a secondary effect. And the reason is because for really large-scale explosions, you get like the mushroom cloud explosion. And if that's your whole sim, it kind of just feels very controlled and very boring. So if it was a big explosion, adding in like a shockwave on the ground helps integrate it into the footage, because that way it's actually interacting with something. And then on top of that, having like lots of dirt and things like that all kind of shooting out here means it's affecting the ground. And that way it feels a lot more threatening. Having shooters like these guys coming out as well helps emphasize scale. And that's really important as well. Usually it's going to be more either movie style large scale explosions or military explosions. you might see some of that stuff. You're not usually going to see it from a car explosion. And I only mention that just because it's one of those things that's kind of easy not to think about, throw it in there, and then kind of move on with your day. But yeah, it's just something that typically you're not actually going to see. So you got to look at, well, what else can I add in? It might be sparks. It could be a lot of different things. So there's a couple of elements here that are CG that I think work really well. If I were to do this, I would actually break it into 2 or 3 different elements. Basically, I'd have a lot of fire burst out in a quick flash, which wraps around the hood. And that's what that element kind of is doing. It's residual fire in the beginning, is more how it's being treated. And I believe this car itself is on fire. So maybe that's just part of the element. But I feel like it's just the way it's acting. I feel like it's probably CG. But the reason I bring it up is because, again, I'm always hesitant to comment on other people's work, but that's what I'm doing here. This shot in particular just kind of really stood out to me as this being a very, very bulbous, just kind of big explosion. And I feel like in a lot of ways, like less is more. Having the explosion occlude more underneath the hood and not become so big over here, the more that it interacts with the car and suppresses some of the fire because it's inside of the hood a lot more, I think that that's actually going to make it feel a lot more realistic. The other thing that kind of drives me nuts is that if you look, like, the job of creating fire is a lot easier when there's already fire in the shot. When you don't have any fire in the shot, it becomes a lot more difficult because then you're introducing this giant light source and you've got to make it believable. But when you're complementing other fire that's already in there, it makes it really easy to just match it to how it looks, and it works. The thing is, if you look at all of the fire in here, because this is, you know, it's meant to be at nighttime, so it's low light. So it's acceptable to have this sort of exposure going on for the fire. And if you look at a lot of how Snyder's art directed all the muzzle flashes and a lot of the fire, a lot of the embers later on, he's definitely trying to go for the oversaturated, low light sources wherever possible. But the thing is, if you look at any of the fire in the shot, it should be really easy to say, well, this stuff's really blown out, so I got to go for more of a blown out effect here as well. But I feel like, and maybe this is more of a director comment or a supervisor comment, but that's where I would kind of point out this stuff, because it just doesn't fit when you got little fire that's way more, like it's a much brighter light source than the actual explosion is. And so that kind of is counterintuitive. So when you got this massive explosion and it's actually not nearly as bright as the fire, which is just hanging there, it really feels weird right away. But like I said, I feel like if you were to suppress a lot of the explosion inside the car, you still get a lot of this leaking out as it is here. It would just be about more interacting with everything. Right now, I feel like none of it, like it is interacting, but I just don't feel like it really does a good job interacting. So there's that. But I mean, you know, like I said, it's difficult picking on this stuff because I can imagine a lot of times it might be a note. You know, hey, you know, it's too flat. Give me more color range, and then you do, or you assume that in comp they're going to, you know, punch it out, so you just give it as much range as possible. And unfortunately, that isn't the case. But like, you can look at these side by side, and obviously this has got smoke occluding it, things like that, but it just isn't nearly as bright. And also just the little things that you can pick up on, like looking at the plate, it's so easy to take the information that's in there and say, okay, cool, like let me replicate that. So you look at the chromatic aberration that you get from the fire, stuff like that. Those artifacts and things like that, like they're there to help you because you want to try and make your explosions not look so perfect and clean. And so doing stuff like this, like over sharpening your fire, can create artifacts, which can actually be something that really works. Stuff like that just can work really well. And I'm just looking at the reflections in the water and stuff. I mean, they're there, which is good. But yeah, so I'll move on. But I just wanted to mention that because it's one of the first visual effects in the actual movie and it's always one from the very first time I see it. It's just like, like, you know, I've got very mixed feelings about it. So moving on here, we got it's also typical Snyder. He's got like a lot of speed ramps in there, which I'm not a huge fan of. But so you got all these like muzzle flashes coming by, which you can see they're from helicopter. And this is what I was mentioning about, like, where it seems like either Snyder, I assume Snyder because I believe he was DP as well as director on this, but so I'd assume that he's kind of taking full control of the visuals as well, but maybe it's the VFX Super made the call, but you can tell that the colors are really saturated, and especially for low light, like it's, you know, I'd say it's more of an artistic preference to kind of push things down a little bit, push the brights down and get more range to make it look really beautiful. But in some cases, like less information, like blowing stuff out, it's just gonna sell as being a lot more real. So anyway, something like this, I mean, it's not that big a deal because I believe the Olympus is the... I've only watched the movie once. I tried to watch it a couple of times more and I just couldn't get through it. But I believe that's their, like, the dummy hotel that's been planted in this movie. So this is a digital model. I mean, most of the shots you see in the movie are just completely digital. So it's not that big a deal to do something like this. All you're doing is you're just going to make sure that everything is built for dynamics. And that's the thing, is it's very easy to say, hire a modeler and go make me, you know, a model that represents visually how it needs to look. But you actually got to look at doing... For this to explode and break apart and do everything correctly, you've actually got to build this out specifically for dynamics, which means that you'll have all these layers from like the struts inside of the building, you know, to doing the walls, the glass windows, the window frames, all the bits and pieces you've got to build out as clean topology so that way you can do a dynamic sim on it. And that's exactly what's happening here. Is you got CG helicopters spinning around, it's clipping over here, so there's bits breaking, rocks, dust, elements, stuff like that. And then you got a more major impact here, CG explosion, another major explosion here. And this stuff all works. I mean, again, it's sort of the same thing, but just knowing, like, looking at, you know, what else is a light source in the shot, they're consistent. Like, these are all low light, and then the explosions are all low light. It's just when you got the fire, which is, it shouldn't be nearly as bright as the explosion, that's the sort of thing that looks kind of odd. Okay, so let's talk about a shot like this. So this is them airstriking Vegas. It goes into their process, and I think it's video 2, I'm going to get into doing the digital environments and talking about that stuff. So I'll get way more in depth about it all. But they basically had to make a 3D model of Vegas. I wouldn't be surprised in some cases where they're like, hey, let's just go and shoot a plate of this so we can digitally populate crowds in and do all the stuff. But I feel like because they had a digital model, it's kind of like, well, you know, we don't even need to go and shoot plates for this. So I'm not 100% sure whether this is entirely CG, but I'm just going to assume it is. Just from a practicality point of view of, like, if you're going that far to build all this out, then, like, why not? So yeah, I'm pretty confident saying this is an entirely digital shot, which means that this would be a sky dome, like matte painting in the background. And then you just have these CG planes coming in, dropping these missiles, and basically airstriking everything. So if you think about it, the amount of detail that goes into this is utterly insane. And so everything down here is going to be crowd simulations that you're pretty much going to be baking out. I'd imagine, just knowing that there's so much of it, that you're probably going to be simming in patches. So you got like sections around here of where you're populating crowds in, doing their thing. Obviously, you're not really getting to look at this too heavily, but baking all this out, it's a lot of geometry. But from there, you've got these digital explosions going off, and then obviously they need to displace and destroy these crowds. So it's very subtle, you don't really get to see it too much, but you can kind of see that the explosions are affecting, like, there's like a blast radius, so it's knocking people or zombies down in those areas. The explosions themselves, I mean, it's not too difficult to do CG explosions these days. Like, back in the day, it was definitely an art form. Whereas now it's not that difficult to pull it off, but it's always, if it just doesn't look right, then that's a huge distraction. So it's more when it isn't done right that it becomes a problem. These all look great, like they all work. They're daytime shots too, so you don't need to worry about glows. That's like one of my, big pet peeves that I see a lot, is such a crime when you're doing a daytime shot. So in other words, we're not talking about low light, we're talking about pretty bright overall lighting. And then you got glow and stuff like that. It just doesn't work. You're not going to get that in camera. So the more that you understand about how lighting and cameras, lenses, camera sensors interpret light and color, the better you're going to be overall at doing this stuff. Little subtle things that you take for granted, but the interactive lighting on the explosion there, because you got to understand, like, explosion or fire is a light source, and because of that, it's going to illuminate everything around it. Again, daytime, you're not going to see it as much, but you can see, if you look at this area here, as that explosion happens, you gain this interactive lighting pass, and all that is global illumination. But that sort of thing really helps sell the shot. So there's not too much to it, but this is completely digital. You got zombies all populated through there. You got smoke pillars all populated everywhere. It's more, I think, about adding so much to it that a lot of this you don't visually see. You don't get a chance to pick this apart, but the more dense it is with all these things going on, it just really richens the shot. So I think this is beautiful the way it's put together, and the fact that it is completely 3D is really impressive as well. But just more from the sheer amount of detail in the data sets and everything else. And the way that you would do this is that you go through with a LiDAR scanner, whether it's Faro or I'm not sure which one they're actually using, but you go through with a LiDAR, scan everything, but also then do photogrammetry as well. And I'll get into this when we talk about digital environments, but in my experience, like LiDAR and photogrammetry together is kind of the perfect combination, because LiDAR by itself, it'll give you correct, like physically accurate laser data, but it's not very usable. If you'll look at it, in fact, I think there's like one of the makings of, like, they interviewed the LiDAR company, and you can see the data sets they were working with, like, they looked ugly, and they were like, these look amazing, and it's just like, no, they look terrible. But you take the point cloud information, and then you run it through like a photogrammetry pass, and the photogrammetry is taking lots and lots of images to build out a lot of detail, but because it's got the physically accurate LiDAR scan, it's not guessing and kind of like making what it thinks it looks like. It actually has data to work with. And I found even oddly with the iPhone 12, I've got one, I haven't even connected it for being used as a phone yet, but I just got one for the LiDAR. And I just wanted to test it out. We ran some tests for this Warner Brothers show recently, and I was using a $20,000 LiDAR scanner, and I was comparing it to the iPhone here. And the iPhone by itself, like, it doesn't have much range. It does like 5 feet, but in combination with LiDAR, it was pretty comparable to what you would get from the 20K LiDAR. The difference is the LiDAR scanner by itself, like, picks up so much. It was picking up the insides of people's houses across the street. Like, it's so accurate, and it's got so much range, but it's just interesting doing the two as a combination. So I just figured I'd jump into some of the other sequences in the opening scene. This is just another street shot, so I'd assume they just found some like under development, like suburban area. You're tracking in the shot here, so it's just adding in crowds of people. I'd say this is all captured in frame. Then you just add some smokestacks, dirty up the shot, add in the CG Chinooks, and some more CG explosions. That's all it really needs to be. So I'd assume that, there's not really any need for digital crowds or anything in these shots at all. And then here's just more squibs. And this is what I was talking about. When you're doing these as a one-off, that's one thing, but when you're doing a whole movie where you basically identify, like, okay, these are all the squib shots we got to do, including these guys back here, then you start grouping these together as a sequence of all the squibs and everything you got to get done. It becomes a lot cheaper because you're doing a large amount of them. Once you build a workflow and get a system and a rhythm going for it, it's not that big a deal to knock out like 2 or 3 a day. And so you have like 3 or 4 artists just doing all of these kind of digital one-off shots by themselves. And same thing with all the muzzle flashes here. You know, just so that way you've got some interesting flashes and stuff like that. Okay, and then we'll talk about this shot here. So another one, it's got speed ramping. So anytime you got any weird speed ramp like this, typically you're going to do that in post. So if we would imagine the edit, what you would get is you originally film everything at, I'm assuming this is 120 because it's not like mega slow motion. So let's just say it's 120 FPS. You bring it in, you ingest it, goes through I/O. Over here, the editor, let's say the VFX editor gets it, sends it over to their editor, but usually one of these two is going to be doing the speed ramping. And because either the editor has sent over their rough cut and said, here's the speed ramp, and then just mimicking the curve, or it's just all done here. But basically, when VFX gets it, it's not going to be speed ramped unless there's a specific reason for it. So you end up with way more frames to work with. So let's just say that, like, how long is this? This is like 10 seconds. This is a long shot. So even then, you'd be looking at perhaps 15 seconds, something like that. So you'd basically get all the information, render it all out. It means that the VFX artist then have to work with way more frames. It means you got to simulate more frames and everything else. But it means that you're working with the longer sequence, basically. Now, if that's a pain in the butt, then you can also break this up into shots and say, well, these explosions don't happen until later on, so perhaps we just cue them to come in later on. So you got this much bigger comp. If this was the timeline, you got all these effects sitting here, and then these other new introduced ones, perhaps, you know, it's not that big a deal because they're starting late. But anyway, I just figured I'd mention that because I do feel like there are some of us who, like, if you haven't had much experience with this, it's like, oh, I gotta, you know, speed up all my 3D elements and go crazy with this. And it's like, no, you just get a long sequence, you render it all out. So 3D might render, obviously it's way more than 200 frames, but as an example, and then the VFX editor would apply that speed ramp in there, and then it's only 150, you know, FPS, 150 frames or something like that, and then that goes to the editor. That's the sort of thing, like, that's how you typically do it. Now, being that it's about 15 seconds, it's going to be about 400 frames, something like that. I've worked in some shots that are couple of minutes long, like 4 minutes long, all simulated, billions of particles. It's not fun. Anyway, same things. This is basically just a bunch of people on a green screen, and then you go to digital Las Vegas. So I think having a 3D Las Vegas is the saving grace. It just means that you have complete freedom to do whatever you want in here. So if you look at all the effects, you basically got a bunch of CG planes, they're flying over. You got the tracer fire coming down. Get some impacts. All of this is out of focus as well, which is disheartening when you do these really cool sims and then they're all blurred out. But this is something that I talk about a lot in my mentorship, is race to comp. In other words, typically 3D starts on something. What I recommend is get first pass into comp right away, because what you want to do is you want to see this in context. Because you might go and, like, get all this detail and get this rolling and get all this stuff. Or maybe even your soup, because I've had those conversations too, where people are just noodling the crap out of your stuff, being like, no, it's not right, send it back for 30, 40 versions. And then we look at it in comp, it's like, wait a minute, like, this female Elvis is here, these crowds are over here, and this is all out of focus. Like, why did I just spend 3 weeks in this shot and you don't even notice any of the stuff? So when you see it in context, in other words, get it into comp, look at how it's actually going to look, you know, with crowds in the foreground, out of focus, all these other things, then you can make your decisions about how much detail, how much time needs to actually go into doing this sort of thing. So again, those interactive lighting passes, like having light splashing on here, really helps. And that's the thing, if this was just all footage and you just had some placeholder geometry, you mightn't be getting that kind of interactive lighting, but the fact that it is all digital all the detail, everything, it all matters. So you might, it's very subtle, but you might notice also the way that the mini Eiffel Tower starts to fall down. This is a dynamic sim, and what they've done is created joints for all this. So you've got these joints set up where they're all linked. So they've got these little points all through here. And so you would initially get this section here to blow out. We change the color. And then you'd have all these other areas that are set up as a dynamic sim. In fact, I just put out an interview with Sam Wickert, the director for Chalk Wars. And there's a big shot in Chalk Wars where there's a water tower full of water. The legs get blown out exactly like this. And the whole thing begins to collapse down. And it's full of water. It splashes all over this robot made of chalk. And it looks pretty cool. So I did all that in Tyflow, actually. And yeah, exactly the same thing. You would just set up all these joints. And then you would rig through like a wrap deformer. So wrap deformer to the original mesh. So you'd have like a custom setup going on here. And then, yeah, you would then re-skin the original Eiffel Tower geometry to your custom rig. And the custom rig is bending and buckling and beginning to collapse down. And it does like a semi-realistic simulation of all the metal bending and deforming. And the other thing too is it's got to land in the correct spot. So, you know, whether you just kind of noodle it or whatever, because it's got to fall down here. I love Richard Cheese is like, watch out, Elvis. Then it hits. So you got to choreograph it to kind of fall and hit its mark. But it's not that difficult to either just kind of rig it to do that, or you can set up some goal weights where it's kind of like it has an end destination in mind, and all the particle simulation, the dynamics will kind of accommodate to that. So all the stuff in the foreground, these are all just actors, green screen, and then all of that is completely 3D in the background. Okay, so let's talk some blood. I'm assuming, I could be wrong, but I'm assuming that this is all 3D blood. In fact, yeah, totally 3D blood. When you pause it, you can always see. One of the things that is like a big gripe for me with CG blood is like when people don't get the motion blur right, it looks so bad. Especially no motion blur, or they use like image motion blur. God, it's really terrible. This is great. Like, I'm really digging this stuff. I feel this is really thick overall. I feel like the CG blood in a lot of these sims is like really kind of clumpy and thick, but I like it. I think that it's just got its own style. So I feel like it's quite different to what you would typically expect, but I think it works. A lot of the stringiness these days is just like a value, depending on if you're using RealFlow or you're using the flip solver in Houdini or Phoenix or however you want to go about it. Like Equalizer with Denzel. Like Denzel never wanted to get his, you never want to get dirty. So anytime like he stabbed someone, shot someone, whatever in that movie, we had to create blood effects for it all because he didn't want to get dirty on set. And so it's, you end up doing a lot of this stuff and staring at blood all the time. This sort of thing, you pretty much got a dummy saw. It's probably not even touching him. There's probably quite a distance between the saw and him. But the way this is set up, let me just play through it really quick. But the way that you typically would do this sort of thing is that this would be an object replacement. So this is practical, but then the saw itself is completely CG. So I'd say this is a digital saw, and you got it spinning, doing its thing, and that way you can get a lot closer to the talent than you could if you didn't have that at all. And then all this stuff here is just, you know, cutting in, so you got a 3D track and it just kind of moves in, and you just have this stuff shooting out. So he's giving it an initial velocity, so it just has the first velocity, bam, shoot out. This thing's spinning, which would catch some of it. The main thing is like what really makes it. Yeah, I'd say there's a few different emitters on here. Some are like high velocity, then you got some that is more kind of there to fill it out. So I think there's like two different types of simulations going on. But what really makes it is you've got a few different elements. You got the hero, what do you call it? Blood, I guess, which is typically going to be this stuff here. And I feel like that's the kind of stuff that's primarily shooting out I feel like there's the secondary one, which is more to fill it out, which is more that clumpy stuff that I was talking about. So I feel that's more very specific. But then on top of that, you've got this blood mist. And this really is important because something like this, especially this close, you need that sort of spray or mist, because otherwise it just seems like a very clean bunch of simulations. But by having that, it makes it just feel like the stuff's exploding everywhere. And then you got these little blood spritz everywhere, which are really important as well. I've done so much CG blood in my time. But yeah, you've got the hero blood, but then you got the spritz and the mist. So these are really critical, and they're more there to fill in the negative space, and that way the whole effect ends up being more like that, rather than it just being some like little fine strings. But yeah, I like how this turned out. I think it's really cool. But that's typically how you would break it down. It's just, you have a CG saw in there, and that way you can get a lot closer. You've match moved him, and you're just emitting crap loads of the stuff. And so that's kind of cool. So they've actually done a practical squib as well. So as he gets closer to him, you see that he goes from having nothing really on him to, right, in that jump cut, he actually gets hit and he's got blood all over him. And that actually does two things, because then it gives you this practical element as well. Okay, sorry, I'm looking at this a bit more, so now I understand. So yeah, basically, now I can see this right. That's the downside of looking at stuff frozen. That's kind of neat. So yeah, I mean, again, you're just getting the upper body, and then I believe the whole upper body is match moved and shifted a little bit, but either way, you're going to create like that digital wound area there. Not too big a deal, but I like it. Yeah, so it's just nothing's really changed except for the digital body in the center. So this kind of starts to tilt slightly, but everything else is connected. And that's all 3D blood and all the mist and everything else we talked about. So just talking about this shot for a second, I'd assume that the parachute is 3D. I mean, that's typically how you do this sort of thing, but it looks so good here. So hats off to the, I think more the shader as well as the cloth sim for doing that if it is simulated. Maybe it isn't, but yeah, I would just assume that it is, and all you're doing is wire work for this person being lower down. This is all 3D, everything's 3D. So just on a green screen, shooting down, that's all 3D. And then you basically got these people here who are real, and then all the rest are digital. Yeah, like I said, like usually you would do this as CG, and maybe that's the gag. Is that they drop the canopy at the end of the shot. I don't know. Maybe I'm overthinking things, but yeah, I mean, this is definitely all CG, including CG parachute. It's just, I feel like at the end it looks really, really good. So I'm just wondering if that's maybe like, assuming it's a longer shot. In fact, it is a longer shot. So yeah, I'd say that that's the gag, is that you've got digital, like these are real straps, but at a certain point, they're all splintering off. I'd say it's all digital. And it's just at the end, these are all 3D, but you drop the canopy on top of him, and that's all practical, I think. Unless, like I said, I'm overthinking things. Stuff like this I just figured I'd mention, just because, again, it's just more about like CG muzzle flash, doing a squib, shooting out all this stuff. They've gone 3D for the whole thing, rather than like, you could easily do this all in camera. All the stuff in the background, like that store, has pretty much been replaced with fire and CG zombies. So pretty straightforward. The funny thing is, a lot of the time you end up doing CG replacements of the reflections. These days, like a lot more. Just that way you're not constrained with having to not get the angle you want to shoot from, because obviously it's going to reflect the crew and the camera behind him. So I thought I'd mention this. So again, CG muzzle flash, and it's kind of cool because again, light source. So they've gone and added these lens flares on top. I was just chatting with Dottie Starling, the VFX suit for Underground Railroad, and that's one thing that she was doing with Industrial Light and Magic, was basically spending a day going, and because there was very specific lenses they wanted to shoot with and get lens flares for, but they wanted to get that style that the DP wanted, and then go and recreate those digitally. So they'd go and get a camera and try and like mimic with those lenses the exact look that they wanted. And the thing is, because you can't have a lens flare typically over your screen and then add effects in behind. So you always got to remove the lens flare and then add it back in over the top. So going and shooting a bunch of clean lens flares, which is what Andrew Kramer's done with Video Copilot, allows you to add those back in, which is pretty cool. So those shoots are always fun because you're just aiming a light down the sensor, trying to imitate the same sort of effect. So I figured to mention this really quick. You could either do the CG or live action. This is all live action, you can tell. It just looks really cool. But I feel like knowing some of the effects that they've done in the show, it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to do one sort of like this. I think this would just be really fun to pull off. So I think that's really fun. And all it is just lots and lots of little mini charges. And you've got this dummy here that's pretty much just like stapled down to the car hood, and they're just making it explode in controlled charges. Pop, 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 pop. Looks awesome. And then from there, it's lots of 3D blood on top. So once you shoot this, you're going to get like chunks exploding and doing its thing, but then you're going to add in all the mist as well as all the CG blood, and he's going to try and time it to the pop. So it's pop, 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 and then just have the stuff litter out everywhere. So the 3D is there, but it's more to add to what's already going on. And that way you're getting all these chunks, like everything's kind of more organic and less controlled. So I think that's really cool. So gross. And then stuff like this, again, completely 3D. He's just going to be on a green screen. The tank, everything's there. The muzzle flashes and the smoke are all CG. And yeah, I mean, CG planes, fire, smoke, the whole deal. So like the amount of crowd work and just the amount of just getting continuity between the shots, like, okay, now we're going to have like just blood everywhere. This is daytime, probably 24 hours after all the crap went down. Is this kind of interesting seeing all this continuity going on? So I'd say that's the cutoff, is that, what do you call it? Beam? It's not a beam, but pillar thing. Over here, I'd say it's the cutoff there, and then all of this is just CG. And then you got some stuff like here. So again, the fact that this is completely photoreal, you know, like you know exactly where this is. Like, it's kind of like LA. If you're in like Venice Beach or somewhere like that, you know exactly what it is. So there's a set expectation of how it's going to look, and they've pulled it off really beautifully. Again, you can pretty much tell like what's 3D, what's not. Anyway, you get the idea. So this is great. It's kind of funny these days. You end up doing this stuff CG just because it's also you know, it's just easier to add that in later than to actually shoot it with it. But in addition to that, so I think there's a wide shot here. So stuff like this, like if you were to actually shoot this on location, there's a lot of penalties for polluting the environment these days that you got to abide by. And that's why like you'll see CG smoke a lot more in film than you would previously, because it's easier to get some of the stuff in camera, but then you got to go plant a bunch of trees and spend a lot of money. to compensate for it. So again, pretty much entirely CG, if not entirely CG. I would imagine that this is real, just there. And it's more like, why not? I mean, you've got the talent, you're doing the shot, so like, it wouldn't take that much more to do that shot. Obviously, this is scaled down. Like, you know, you'd be shooting this probably like more full frame, but then you're shrinking it down to there, and then, so you're pulling the camera out and doing a much more epic shot. Okay, so let's talk this. So again, completely CG, looks pretty cool. I got mixed feelings about it, but again, it's always tricky because in reality, I think a lot of this would blow out to white, and I feel like maybe that's just the problem here is that they're being told not to. But before it made sense, like in the nighttime shots, it made way more sense to have like low light looking stuff like that. But in daytime, all of this is going to blow out because it's going to compensate for the fact that the sky, like the lighting, everything is so bright. So everything tends to prevent it blowing out, to look like, to have a lot more visibility on everything. You gotta underexpose your camera, and it still basically means that all this stuff is going to blow out to white. And the problem is that none of this is like, if you look here, this is great. There's some hot stuff in there a little bit, but all of this is hot and it should be blown out. And unfortunately, you get this pastel looking stuff instead. So, you know, I'm wondering whether that's just like a creative note that they were told to do that, but yeah, it kind of is distracting from like what you would expect. Whereas like this stuff here, the contrast, like this is more what you expect. And I also feel like if you were to desaturate this, I'm kind of tempted to do it. So just for fun, I'm just going to get the whites and punch them up a little bit. And then I'm going to get the saturation and pull it back a little bit. But that's more what you would be expecting to see. Still feel like it's like way too yellow, but yeah, I mean, contrast, pull the shadows down, but like that's more what you would expect to see on here, and it's just unfortunately you're getting more of this sort of look which just doesn't match. I spend so much damn time on Fire, so you know, end up picking this stuff apart. I love the crowd simulations. I can see them all getting knocked back, like that sort of stuff. Again, like you pretty much just get like a velocity, like a radial velocity field, and you're having these kind of exploding out everywhere, and they're just causing everyone to get knocked back. I feel like that. I keep looking at the palm trees here. I feel like there's a bit of a delay from them getting hit, but maybe that's these explosions down here that you just can't really see because it's all occluded. But yeah, I mean, the stuff's beautiful. I mean, it's such an amount of work. I'd love to know what the render times were on some of this stuff. The other thing I figured I'd mention, it's more of a pet peeve, but again, we're talking about shooters earlier, and then these guys are coming out. They're really thick, but some of these just instantly, some of these just instantly stop. You'll watch them as they come through, and it's because you're simulating in a grid. So if I were to do a grid like this, and I got this big explosion going out like that, I'm gonna have these trails shooting out too. And it's a lot easier, instead of having to like make the grid bigger, to just have them kind of end all of a sudden. And it's either that or you simulate these individually, but still, you can see like a good example is like these two here. If you just track like that guy there, it shoots up and then just stops. And stuff like that, it's kind of distracting because they're subtle, and I think it's important to have them. But the problem is when they're very uniform, like the way these are shooting out, they're just going to stay the same. So when they stop all of a sudden, it looks really weird. the best way to do stuff like that is to, I mean, if you had like a big explosion, is to have these actually scale down over time. So what ends up happening is that over time, the radius that they're, like, let's say you're emitting from a particle or something, the radius goes down over time to the point where it doesn't pick up on it anymore. And while you're doing that, you can also set, so it's based on the age of the emission, you'd have the radius go down, but you also have the density, which is how much fuel or smoke, whatever, that goes down. So eventually there's nothing emitting, but it's more of a gradual thing. But when it abruptly stops, that's the sort of stuff that, like, it's just, you pick up on it. Even though you're looking at all of this stuff here, that stuff just kind of ends up being very kind of finicky. So this is good to be aware of that stuff. So yeah, like, I would just have it tapering in the whole time, and that way eventually it just stops emitting because it becomes too small for the voxel size of the grid itself. But like I said, this stuff here looks beautiful. The saturation, again, is like overkill for what you would see. But I think that's like the reoccurring theme here, is they're kind of being told to up the saturation and everything. But this stuff should be blown out. And because of that, you end up with these pastel colors instead. So just to talk about a few more things really quick. I'd assume these are all digital because, like, when you're doing ambitious shots like this, doing some of this isn't a big deal. But I like it because it tells a story. You got humans on one side, you got zombies on the other, and then there's this one gap here. So they're moving this one piece of machinery over to it. So this here again, digital Vegas, people in the foreground. You got fire, smoke, everything to kind of show chaos. I'd assume this dude's on green screen, and that's just all digital. 3D. And again, something like this, it's not hard to do in 3D, but it's subtle things like having these rocks. I mean, these rocks came from nowhere, right? I mean, this thing's been dangling in the air for forever, so just suddenly having these rocks dropping down, you know, ahead of everything, it's just there because these subtle things just help it not feel so 3D. Same thing of having the sparks as it kind of hits in place. Little things like that. You know, the dust. Like, why, you know, I mean, maybe you'd have dust, but this is the sort of stuff that is just, it's a touch of realism that really just sells the shot. Because otherwise you just have a bunch of geometry, it's just hand animated, it has really good lighting and texturing, but it's the subtle little effects that, rather than being like big, ambitious effects like these guys, is these subtle little things that really help sell that this thing's real, it's interacting with everything. So there's some green screen, all CG. And yeah, it does the shot and tells the story. Same thing, green screen. I like this old digital, just insane. So one other thing I'll quickly mention is that I'm going to play through this kind of quick. You'll notice here it's one shot. So it starts out here, cranes over, and then lifts up, and then comes down. And then suddenly you're in Atlanta, in Georgia, where they shot this. So this is just doing a sky replacement. So in other words, like this here is where you just roto all this, and you just have it replaced with the actual sky, and it's all part of this shot here. So basically, you're just rotoing this, and as long as you got the camera track. And the camera track just needs to be making sure you have something to track. You can't track nothing. So either you got a rig in the background, is something there that you can work off of, or overscan, which means that the plate itself is actually more like that, and that way they have the top of the building and also the power line, things like that they can work off of, and then you're just cropping in on the section here to get what you want. Finally, I thought I'd just mention a few of these shots, and I'm going to just bump up the exposure because they're quite dark. But this sort of thing, I mean, Walking Dead is a good example where it's just like, you see this stuff all the time now. And all you're doing is you got all these actors, and what they have is a knife. And the knife actually just doesn't have a handle. And so what they're doing is it's just a handleless knife that they're using for these shots. Occasionally you'll see people with a knife with a real handle, but anytime that they're going to stab someone, they've got a replica of the same knife that doesn't have a handle to it, and you're tracking in a 3D handle into the shot. So that's typically how you do that stuff. So there's a lot of this. So this is all one shot. Initially stabs there, brings down, stabs another one, and so as you're doing this, I feel like he's already bleeding on his head, so I'd say like he's already got the makeup on his head, but then you've got, you know, the CG kind of squibs shooting out everywhere, stuff like that. And that's how you do something like that. It's just you're literally just match moving everything. You're doing an object track for the hand. It's got a CG blade. As it goes in, then you're doing the 3D squibs on top. And you just have a team of people that's just all they're focused on. Same thing here. I just thought I'd include these, but this again is all these muzzle flashes. Again, you would get color, but I feel like these are more transparent than they should be. The saturation is way up, but I feel like that's just Snyder's style. Because, I mean, you look at any of these lights, like, why are they not, you know, oversaturated and all these other things? It's because they were shot in camera, and because it wasn't a creative note to, you know, to suddenly have them be way oversaturated. So I just thought I'd point this out, but like, yeah, you're gonna do a lot of this where usually what you do is you'll have either muzzle flashes in the gun itself or just lighting in that general area, and you're just timing all your effects to match that. There's more of that stuff. Oh yeah, I thought I'd talk about this as like the last thing in this video. So her buddy, I keep thinking, like, this is good writing, because this is the one character in the show I keep thinking, like, what if she lived? Because clearly, you know, she was more badass than anyone else in the whole movie, I feel. So I keep thinking, like, if she lived, like, maybe everything would have turned out a lot differently, just knowing that she definitely survived for a long time. So her friend puts her out of misery by not shooting her, but instead blowing her up. So this is more of a visual indicator, because if you just had the bullet hit and explode, it's kind of hard to kind of tell what the heck's going on. So instead, you get this initial bullet hit that looks like it's 3D, but then they've gone and added a bunch of sparkle kind of effects on top. It's a few different terms depending on what you're comping in or what plugin suite you're using in Nuke, but basically you just got these kind of some optical effects on top of the brights. So that's happening there, and then you've just got, again, like, this is way glowier than you would expect in real life. I'm mentioning this not to say, like, oh, this isn't real. Of course it's not real, but it's more that these are necessary to tell a story. When you've got so much chaos going on, this is where making certain effects really obvious by making this hot kind of glow around the bullet impact, that allows you to focus in on, okay, despite all the action, the quick cuts, the zombies, everything going on, I'm able to identify that this backpack of fuel just got hit, and it just makes more sense as to like why it explodes. And that's why, again, like, you're not going to see that, okay? It isn't radioactive, but as from a story perspective, it helps as a visual cue to tell, like, okay, she's about to explode. And this is the light wrap, so that's all done in comp, I feel. So what's interesting here is that this is a CG explosion, but then it's switching to using stock footage in here as well. And then there's lots of 3D crap coming out of it. So it's a combination, and it's typically because this might end up being really blown out, but then you just add in lots and lots and lots of fire passes rolling at the camera to kind of get a lot more color range back in there again. And you see a few of those pieces fly out there just for continuity's sake, so it just doesn't feel like he's sitting there clean. So I thought I'd start with this section, kind of go through it all. I mean, we covered a lot, but this is specifically all the random stuff that is more for the first part of the series, and then we're going to get into talking about the CG character effects, whether it's zombies, heads exploding, or Valentine, the tiger eating, I forget the character's name. We're going to talk about nuking Las Vegas and everything else in between. So there's going to be a lot that we'll get into, but I just thought I'd talk about this one first, knowing that it's a little bit different to what we're talking about the rest of the time. And as we get into it, the other sequences I think are going to be a lot more fun to talk about, but I thought we'd start out here. And next video, we'll be getting further into this. We're going to be covering the whole end sequence, including the helicopter crash and the nuclear bomb going off and everything there as well. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Then we'll get into digital environments, we'll get into the creature effects, and the last video we'll be talking about Tig Notaro, adding her into the movie, because obviously before Chris D'Elia was the original actor for the movie, and for one reason or another got replaced later on. So I think it's kind of fascinating that you can add talent after the fact into a movie now, and a lot of the ways that they did that I think it'd be fun to talk about. So that's pretty much it, but hopefully this kind of whets your appetite. Like I said, I think we'll be doing a lot more really fun stuff as we get into some of the more ambitious sequences. Not to say that this stuff isn't ambitious. And yeah, like I said, I've been a bit picky about some of the explosion stuff. It's easy to pick on someone's shot. I feel bad for whoever did this shot, but a lot of the time in production, it isn't necessarily your call. And that's why I wanted to mention, I do feel like there are certain things here, me personally, I would do differently. I would have been focusing on more elements that are interacting, like wrapping around the car, and less making a big uniform explosion because of that. But like I said, it's mainly to do with the way that, the style of all this stuff, even in daytime, tends to be really oversaturated. And then the brights are pulled down, which looks weird. But in certain shots like this, where, like I said, like the tracer fire from the helicopters, everything is following that kind of style. It ties together. But when you have real life fire and then you have the CG fire and they don't look the same, that visually causes a big problem. Then there's stuff like those tracers and just I feel like it needs more interaction, wrapping around the car, stuff like that. So it's just, for whatever reason, this shot in particular stood out, but it's consistent throughout all of the shots. So it isn't necessarily just like, oh, that's a bad shot. It's more about, I think, certain visual cues, or specifically that have been made here. So anyway, there's certain things I'm picky about, but overall, I mean, it's so ambitious doing all this stuff. So I'm really impressed overall. I think that everyone who worked on this did an amazing job. But it is also fun just to kind of break this all down and kind of look through the process and kind of discuss how you approach doing a lot of the stuff. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll be back tomorrow with the next part in the series. Each week I plan to review a different film and share as many insights as I can with you. And if there's a particular movie that you want to see covered, leave a comment below and let me know. Or if there's any big questions not answered here in this video that you would like to see covered, let me know as well. I'm happy to hear from you. Creating these videos weekly is a lot of work, but I love sharing and I love helping other creators like yourself. All I ask is, if you want to support this channel as well as ensure that I can create more of these videos, please like and subscribe to my channel, as well as feel free to spread the word so that others can benefit from these videos as well. Like I said, it might not mean much to you, but it'll mean the world to me. And you won't miss out on any of the upcoming content that I put out daily. This has been an absolute pleasure. All of this content I make for free, so that way you can get a better understanding of the visual effects process and filmmaking as well. One last thing, I just recently put out a free course on how to raise your prices, as well as how to land your dream clients as an artist. I've been in the industry for over 25 years, both as an artist as well as a manager, hiring artists as well as managing them, and of course, paying them as well. So I'm very familiar with this topic. For me, it's a pet peeve when people say that there's no money in art, there's no career as an artist, or art doesn't pay. I want to eliminate the starving artist mindset for good. That's why I've created this 8-hour free course on everything I know about pricing yourself as an artist, how to raise your prices, how to land your dream clients that are willing to pay you what you're worth. And at least for now, this course is completely free to download. So get the entire 8-hour free course at pricingclass.com, or click the link below in the description, so that way you can check it out there as well. And if you like this video, I've put another video somewhere up above me that I think you're also going to like as well. I've also put a link to the playlist for all the visual effects breakdowns that you can check out that I've created as well. I'm Allan McKay. Thanks for watching.